So great to see you tonight. We're grateful for you. Thankful to be together to worship once again. And we're thankful for your presence. We're going to be in the book of 1 Peter. 1 Peter chapter 1 will begin in verse number 13 shortly. 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse number 13. If we thought just briefly, kind of along the lines of how Family Feud presents its questions in terms of thinking of a category and then coming up with what an audience might say about that category, just think in your minds about the various things that we would go through preparing for in a given day or week or over the course of months. What is it that we do that we have to prepare for? Can you come up with a few in your mind that you think, oh, these are things that we regularly prepare for? 10 options might be these. We regularly prepare for travel when we make a trip, a test or exam. There's preparation needed for it ahead of time. Weddings involves a lot of preparation and planning. Someone's getting a job interview process involves planning. Cooking a meal, even an everyday or every week kind of routine still involves some planning and preparation. We like to think that we're prepared for emergencies, even though we don't know when they're going to happen. That's a good one, maybe to focus in on for tonight's purposes. Something that we don't know when it's going to happen, but we still must be prepared nonetheless. Moving or relocating takes plenty of planning and preparation. When there's a pregnancy and then a baby arriving, there's need to be prepared. Any kind of party or holiday planning and preparation. Now, if we think about a few of these, think of how the planning process unfolds, but then think about what does it take for us to realize we've missed something, to find out that we were actually unprepared, even though we set out to be prepared. Let's take this travel or vacation line of thinking. All the levels of preparation involved to make a trip. You have to pack your clothes, your shoes. Maybe if you've got children, you have to pack or help them pack their clothes and shoes. Toiletries, electronics, all those things that you bring. But then you have to decide and prepare as it relates to transportation. Are you going to drive? Or are you flying? Or some other means of transportation? If you're not driving, have you secured those reservations efficiently? What about food? Have you made restaurant reservations? Have you seen to it that meals are prepared? What are you doing during the day? Is this a family vacation? You need to provide entertainment during the day. Have you made those reservations for tickets for entertainment? Now, we could have gone through and made a list of all that we need to do, but how do we figure out that we were unprepared? Almost always it comes down to when we need that item or we need that meal or we need to make this decision, we think, oh, I've forgotten it. Maybe the classic example from holiday movies is that of Home Alone when the mom is on the plane and they're going through their minds. It feels like we forgot something, but we just don't know what it is. And then it hits her. Kevin, he's not here. We can set out being prepared in our minds, thinking that we're prepared, but there might come a time when we learn we were actually unprepared. Same could be true for a holiday meal that we're planning to cook. We're having the family over, and again, how do we find out that we are unprepared? It'd be bad if it was Christmas Day and we need batteries for the can opener and we go to open the cranberry sauce or whatever else we're pulling out of a can and we don't have batteries and it doesn't work, and now we're suddenly down the line, and how do we go get batteries on Christmas Day because everybody's closed? And right, you can see how we could think we're dialed in and we're prepared, we've got it all written down, but I'm not prepared. And I find out at a time when it's most inconvenient. As we turn our attention to our discussion about culture and being prepared for a culture that has threats and attacks against our faith, when will we know whether or not we were prepared for the various cultural threats we're facing right now? And how will we know? This text is going to help us to keep that answer in view, but it should be a sobering question for us. Because we could think that we're prepared for this sin or this erosion of culture, and yet we're not actually prepared. Or we could be prepared, but yet we've not prepared our children and upcoming generations. And this text reminds us of how God has prepared us with what we need to know to face any generation's threats, to be able to secure ourselves in Him and in the work of His Son. As we dive into 1 Peter chapter 1, begin in verse number 13. Therefore, preparing your minds for action and being sober-minded, set your hope fully on the grace that will be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. He's beginning to show us an answer to the when question. Be prepared for when? The coming of Jesus Christ. Verse 14, as obedient children, do not be conformed to the passions of your former ignorance, but as He who called you is holy, you also be holy in all your conduct. Since it is written, you shall be holy, for I am holy. And if you call on Him who, as Father, who judges impartially according to each one's deeds, conduct yourselves with fear throughout the time of your exile. Again, another time frame that He lists. Await the judgment and conduct yourselves with fear throughout the time of your exile. Verse 18, knowing that you were ransomed from the futile ways inherited from your forefathers, not with perishable things such as silver or gold, but with the precious blood of Christ, like that of a lamb, without blemish or spot. Let me turn your attention to verse 13 again, how the ESV renders that. But prepare your minds, preparing your minds for action. That's a little different in the ESV than some other translations. Most literally, it's gird up the loins of your mind. We'll get to that in just a moment. But I want to key in on the word prepare, because that's another word Peter is going to use in chapter 3 in a pretty important section of the text. He's going to say in chapter 3, verse 15, in your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, set Him up above all, always being prepared. Always being prepared to do what? To make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that's in you. Yet do it with gentleness and respect. So Peter is saying there, in the midst of your mistreatment, because of your righteousness, you must know that you'll be asked. You'll be put on the spot to give a defense for why you live the way you live. So be prepared for those moments. And just a few verses later, as he turns his attention to Noah and illustrating with Noah's day and God's patience then, they formerly did not obey when God's patience waited in the days of Noah while the ark was being prepared, which a few, that is 8 souls, 8 persons, were brought safely through water. Verse 21, of course, talking about baptism, which now saves us, is the answer for us to obey God. But notice, God was patient while Noah was preparing the ark. How did Noah know whether or not the ark was going to work? When did Noah know the ark had been fully prepared? He knew it was prepared when the floods came. He knew it was prepared when the waters had covered the earth and he was still floating above the waters. He was told what to do. He did it submissively and obediently. He prepared it the way God told him to prepare it. And then when the test came, he survived the test. And then over the course of those many days, it kept surviving the test. So now go back to chapter 1 of verse 13, preparing the loins of your minds, preparing your minds for action. We begin to see this is a section that anchors us into always being prepared no matter what the threats might be. So as we're called exiles in this book, we can be prepared as those exiles. Notice first, just kind of continuing this introduction, we have the promise and the hope that just as Peter was writing to them, knowing they were going to face persecution, he was writing them knowing they could be prepared no matter what. And likewise, we have the same confidence. We can be just as prepared for this generation's and even any future generations' cultural threats just as much as the first century church was prepared for theirs. And we're going to face, and we are facing, any number of scary things that are immoral and that are threatening and that are intimidating. And yet with the promises of God, following after the will of God, we can be just as prepared as any generation has been to face them with the hope He gives us. So let's look first at the concept of mental preparation. 3 different aspects in the text that we find as it relates to preparation. The first is an emphasis on the mind. All right, so as we said, verse 13 most literally says, gird up the loins of your mind. ESV smooths that out to say preparing your minds for action. The emphasis, of course, is the mind, but the reason the ESV throws in there for action is because the girding up the loins was a process tied to action. Okay? So the idea is that the average person wore garments that were basically just a big piece of fabric all the way to the ground. And so when they needed to do something that involved activity, action, they had to tie that garment up around their waist, kind of what we would think about as a diaper, almost, not making light of it, just that might be the mental image we get. And once you tie that around your waist, you could then run if necessary. You could lift, you could build, you could do the physical activity, you could fight in battle if that was the case. You couldn't do those things effectively if you left your tunic going to the ground. But if you tied it up, you were signaling and saying, all right, it's time for action. So we use the phrase when it's time to get after work and to do some hard labor, I'm going to roll up my sleeves, right? Well, that's a similar phrase here. Or if it's time to get to battle, we're going to talk about putting on our armor or grabbing a weapon. Well, that's the language that Peter is using in verse 13. You be prepared for action. You're no longer living in a time that's passive. This is not the time to get comfortable. This is the time to prepare for action. So you be offensive in being defensive against the various threats that you're about to face. Then you keep going in the text. He follows this back up, not only by saying prepare your minds for action, but being sober-minded. Here's the environment of your mind that needs to accompany this action, being clear thinking. Sober-minded. Here, this term involves more than just the thinking. It involves self-control. But it's a controlling of the mind that leads to a controlling of action, restraint. So if the first clause deals with being ready outwardly with action, now the second clause kind of deals with harnessing and having restraint. And you see throughout the book, if you're going to suffer, it better be for righteousness' sake, not because you do evil. Well, here he's saying you be self-controlled, clear-thinking, sober-minded. Now, when we hear the phrase sober-minded, we likely think of substances, substance abuse, and there would be some connection to that, and we could make some application from that this evening, but instead we need to see the connection to how this term references the concept of anxieties and fears. How fears, when they begin to set in, cloud the mind and the heart. Think of how he uses it later in chapter 5, beginning in verse number 7. Oh, there was another loin picture. But chapter 5 and verse 7, casting all your anxieties on him because he cares for you. You shift your fears and anxieties over to the Lord because he cares about you. Now verse 8, be sober-minded, same word. Be sober-minded, be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. Resist him, firm in your faith. Now notice this. The Lord does care that you have anxieties. He wants to take them on. He wants you to shift them to him, and he will help you bear them. But notice, the devil has no concern about your fears. He doesn't care that you're upset and that you're afraid. He will come after you and hunt you down no matter how afraid you are. So you be clear thinking. Allow your mind to be free of those anxieties so that you are prepared for those who are coming after you through the hands and the work of Satan. If we were in the African wilderness and we knew that lions were going to be around and we had taken preparations for lions, weapons, armor perhaps, vehicles, again, when would we know that we were fully prepared? Only if we stared down a lion and were able to come out of that having survived. Well, likewise, Peter is saying the devil is coming after souls just like yours and like your children's and like those in the church around you. So you be clear thinking. Shift your anxiety so that you're not clouded and losing focus, but instead think on the things of God. But then notice next in the text, he says, set your hope fully on the return of Jesus Christ. Set your hope fully on the grace that's to be revealed. He's talked about that living hope that's set aside for us in heaven earlier in chapter 1. Now he pulls that in again, and he says, you take what you know to be true about heaven, and you let that mental truth inform your emotional heart. You set your hope on eternity. Let your mind direct and then settle your emotions to think about the return of Christ. Now notice what that's in contrast to when you get to verse 14. Don't be conformed to the passions of your former ignorance. You have an old life before Christ. Don't be conformed back to how you used to not only live, but he says actually former ignorance. You didn't know the truth. And this is because this is a largely Gentile audience. You were unaware of Jesus Christ. You were unaware of the truth about the God of the universe. You were ignorant, and thus you had these passions. But don't go back to that. Your mind needs to be established on the Lord's return. Your mind needs to be clear thinking by shifting these anxieties as you think about your future with the Lord. And then verse 17, similar idea, back to hope. Conduct yourselves with fear. Now, with fear is a powerful clause to include. You live with the appropriate kind of fear. They're no doubt afraid. But he's saying your enemy to be afraid of is not the Romans. It's not the Jews. The enemy to be afraid of really is the devil, chapter 5. But you need to have a reverent, holy fear toward God that drives your conduct. Just as Jesus would teach in Matthew 10. You be afraid of the one who has the power to destroy both body and soul in hell, and you let that fear be the dominant fear, not the fear of the things around you. So again, let your mind inform your heart. You be hopeful in the things of God, and you be afraid, righteously, reverently afraid of God himself. And then finally, verse 18, thinking about the mind, being mentally prepared, knowing. He uses the term knowing. Coming back to the redemption we've been given by Jesus Christ, he says, knowing that you were ransomed from the feudal ways inherited from your forefathers. There must be this single, solid truth that you keep coming back to. You're setting your mind and your heart on the return of Jesus, but you're also going back to see with certainty what happened when he bought you out of sin. You know this. No matter what gets tossed at your mind, you don't let that influence you. You instead know you've been bought with the precious blood of Jesus Christ. So let's apply this quickly to our current culture. Think about how headlines and news media are able to not only get their message out, but over time just slowly begin to chip away at how we think about the world. We sometimes use the phrase spin, news spin, the spin cycle. Think about what that's referencing. You think about a washing machine and the spinning that keeps happening, and what does that cause? It causes stains to come out. It causes garments to be cleansed of their old kind of way of thinking. Well, now you see the spin cycle of the news is able to change the cultural thinking, not just in one headline or not just in one story, but over time. So this is a site that tries to do its best to present all sides, as it's called that, of an issue. So this is just a screenshot from yesterday morning as it talks about Steve Scalise dropping out of the speaker race, okay? I'm going to highlight some of these and I'll read them for you. But what they did is they say, well, here's the same story represented across 3 different news media outlets, all right? So what they say there from the middle is from The Hill. They call that a center reporting outlet, and their headline is very simple and straightforward. Steve Scalise drops out of the speaker's race. They represent the Washington Examiner to the right as saying Steve Scalise drops out of House Speaker race, quoting him, what this country needs. It was presented as a noble thing. He's doing the right thing for the country by dropping out of the speaker's race. Now you go to CNN online news on the left. Steve Scalise drops out of speaker's race as House GOP faces leadership crisis. So you see in just one single snapshot, the same event happening in Washington, being portrayed as a noble thing, by the Washington Examiner, but being portrayed as crisis by CNN. I think we're aware that that's happening, but are we aware of the potential it has to erode our thinking? That day after day and multiple times a day, we begin to buy into the rhetoric that's behind the facts. How do we discern between a fact and an opinion? You know, our girls are going through some of that study in their schooling, you know, fact versus opinion. How do we do that? Can we discern what's truth versus what's not? That's a headline, and this has become even more important with technology for a couple of reasons. Number one, just over the past few years, people read articles less and less. They read the headline and move on. So the headline might not accurately reflect the article, but if people read the headline, then boom, that must be it. But number two, how this has begun to shift just of late is that these news outlets more and more are relying upon artificial intelligence. And they come in and they say, well, here is the parameters we want to provide. Here's the biases we want to go ahead and bake into our reporting, and we'll let you create the perfect headline to emphasize our biases. So now suddenly there's an automating process that's far beyond our ability to control, and yet it does, if we're not careful, have the potential to control our thinking. We don't control it, but it begins to influence and control us. So now as we think about our own lives, but especially upcoming generations, what kind of headlines are they hearing? What kind of reporting are they hearing? Is it quick sound bites? It's more likely to be on something like TikTok or Instagram now. Now just think of the eroding of culture. You take any topic, and we see it has the ability to undermine truth and just simple, truthful thinking on the level of the mind. But a second way of applying this clear thinking, this mental preparation, is to get down and talk about education. I mean, for decades, maybe even 100 years or so now, we've understood as a country and as a culture, Western culture, just the power of the influence of education as a whole. But what started largely as higher education, higher institutional attempts to kind of change cultural thinking has bled down into public schooling at every level. And there's no surprise that government-funded and public schools are trying to introduce more and more younger grades as kind of necessary or required. No longer first grade, no longer kindergarten, but pre-K, because they want them as early as they can. And because if they want to try to brainwash, then this is a great way they figured out to do it. Now, we're thankful, we're grateful that a lot of the core doctrines, the critical theory kind of things, those are not prevalent in our state or in our systems. But the way we know culture works, we shouldn't be surprised in the next 15, 20 years or so, the battles that parents are fighting in, say, Virginia and in other states, we better be prepared for in Walker County and in Jasper. That just because we're not facing them now doesn't mean we won't be facing them as it relates to this gender ideology and sexuality and those kind of decisions that have to be addressed. And so let's be aware by being prepared, not only now, but being prepared for the future and knowing that any cultural force will attempt to change the thinking, knowing that it changes behavior. All right, let's move on to the text. Let's look at the concept of moral preparation. We be prepared on the level of the mind, but also that's going to be seen in how we live. And you'll notice that as he says, you prepare your minds for action, he then says, here's the actions you must undertake. Because God is holy, you be holy. That's the emphasis beginning in verse number 15. You don't go back into the ways you used to live because you were ignorant of God, but instead you follow God's holiness because he is indeed holy. You must be holy. It's interesting that former ignorance led to passions and desires, that immorality that they were confronted with and would be continually confronted with, the immorality that we see in our own current climate, that will always result from spiritual ignorance. So you lived in a way that was ignorant of God. And now when you see immorality happening around you, you must know that's resulting from a vacuum of spiritual ignorance. So then again, verse 15 and 16, the concept is holiness and God's standard for holiness is our standard for holy conduct. It's not a shifting standard. It's not based on what is accepted for a given cultural generation. I love that this idea in verse number 16, it's a quote. As it is written, or since it is written. There's several texts, all from Leviticus, that you could connect that to. Most likely Leviticus 19 and verse number 2, but also maybe 11, verse 44, a few other places where he says something very akin to this. But as we talked about 2 weeks ago, these are largely Gentile background Christians. And yet Peter continues to use Jewish language to remind them of just how special they are. They're not a subset of the people of God. No, they are the full people of God. And so now, just as the Jewish priests would have heard about the importance of holiness and being holy as God is holy, priesthood language, in fact, now he's saying, you have that special place too. You get to know God as your father, your children, but you get to be holy just as he is holy. That impacts your conduct. But then you'll notice verse number 17, talking about the Father who judges impartially. Notice how he judges, according to each one's deeds. That's so important to notice, because the more immorality runs rampant, the more corruption takes over. Just think about how much of a grip partiality takes on to a culture. And so he's saying, you don't have to fall victim to the culture around you's attempts to persuade with partiality. Instead, you keep calling on the God who judges impartially. And how does he judge impartially? According to each one's deeds. Therefore, how you live becomes paramount. Conducting yourself morally in the midst of an immoral culture is how you know that the God, the Father, will continue to judge you and judge you fairly and righteously. But then I love this phrase in verse number 17, kind of the inspiration for this concept of asking, when will we know whether or not we were prepared? He says, throughout the time of your exile. As long as you're exiled, you must live this way. As long as you're exiled in your current culture, you must live holy lives. You must conduct yourselves with fear. If you stop being spiritual exiles, then maybe things change, but that's not the case, right? That's his point. You're exiles, you're a peculiar people, and so now you must keep living with holiness and being conducted by the fear of God. Here is your responsibility. And then now verse 18, this connects to the morals, because you have been bought. You know we're ransomed from the feudal ways inherited from your forefathers. You make the connection back up to verse 14. The passions of your former ignorance, what did those lead to? It led to verse 18, feudal ways. Those no longer have to have control over you, but you need to see that the ways you were living outside of Christ, and that your mind is informed by Christ, you don't have to live feudally and in vain any longer. That pulls some sober thinking language back into our minds as well when we think about chapter 4. Talked about being sober-minded, verse number 13. He's going to use that phrase sober-minded again in chapter 4, but listen to how he connects it. Chapter 4, opening verse number 1, since therefore Christ suffered in the flesh, arm yourselves with the same way of thinking. All right, so there it is. Same way of thinking. For whoever has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin, so as to live for the rest of the time in the flesh, no longer for human passions, but for the will of God. He says when you are willing to go to the cross and see how Jesus suffered, and you choose that same way of thinking daily, you now find the path for resisting sin. You now find the means and the thinking by which you don't give in to temptation and those passions of your former ignorance. It's a thinking that's willing to suffer with Christ that leads us into moral preparation. When Jesus was warning the Jews, Luke chapter 21, a text that is about events that have already happened. They happened in AD 70. They're not about anything that's happening today or anything that's happened in the past few decades. But Luke 21 is about something that's already happened. But he warned them about the signs, and he says, But watch yourselves, lest your hearts be weighed down. So there's an anxiety, a distraction, a fear. Lest your hearts be weighed down with, notice, dissipation and drunkenness and the cares of life. And then that day come upon you like a trap. That's Luke 21, verse 34. So what he's saying is, I've told you all these signs of when the destruction of Jerusalem is going to happen, but if you get distracted, weighed down, but not just by intimidation, but weighed down because of your own immorality, now you'll be caught off guard. You will think you're prepared, and yet you'll find yourself quickly being unprepared for that day to come. How do we apply this today? There's no area of morality versus immorality that our current culture hasn't seized the moment to influence and increase the immoral side of the equation. So just recently this week, I read about kind of some police officers and justice figures in California who are upset about some of the laws that the state of California has passed, and one of them has to do with prostitution. And it's essentially now no longer possible for them to arrest anyone for selling themselves on the streets as a prostitute. The bill is State Bill 357. It decriminalizes loitering with intent to commit prostitution. Now, it was pushed through largely out of what they claimed were discrimination concerns. Certain people are being discriminated by these kind of laws that criminalize prostitution. So what police officers and other government leaders are saying is it's effectively just made prostitution rampant and widespread. The headline was something along the lines of open sex markets 24 hours a day. And one of the officials, one of the police officers, he used very respectful language. I'm going to try to make it even more respectful, but he basically said, unless someone has their external reproductive parts showing, we can't arrest them for anything. Like, that's the line at which we can finally arrest somebody. But other than that, it's highly legal. It's just allowed, supposedly under the guise of discrimination. Now, that's an extreme example. That's across the country. I get it. But the moral decline has gotten to a point to where let's just allow anybody to do literally whatever they want to do about it. And if they can make money off of it, great. That's the case for almost literally every area of morality versus immorality. Now, that's just one example. But you take any area, if it's gambling, if it's substance abuse, obviously these sexual areas that we've been talking about over the past few months, they're all being exploited because there's no framework of truth or godliness in mind. So, of course, people are going to exploit them for their best ends instead of for the ends that God has in mind. A second observation quickly about this is that the church must be prepared not only to help her members fend off against these influences, to not fall prey to the temptations of sin, but we must be prepared to not give in terms of what we teach about them. Because the stronger the push comes for these to be accepted, and they're accepted legally, if persecution begins to happen because of them, there will be churches who come out and say, well, it's not loving for us to preach about these things. Or it's not loving to take what we've used to teach about them, and we need to kind of update what we teach to reflect this current culture. See, if we're prepared morally, we're going back to God for the stance of holiness. We're not using culture as a guide for holiness, but instead it's His will. And it's His revealed word that guides us in those areas, not only for what we practice, but also what we teach in the church and teach publicly about these things. All right, finally, number 3, we see the need for eternal preparation. It begins in the mind, it's mental, it's moral as it relates to our actions. Ultimately, though, it must be eternal preparation. Obviously, we saw that in verse number 14, to set your hope fully on the grace that will be brought to you at Jesus' final return. That's verse, that's 13. So he's saying, you live with eternity in mind the whole time. You live with the very moment eternity begins as the thing that guides you in all that you do. You constantly set your mind and your hope on that day. Whenever that day is, whether near or far, you set your hope and your mind on that day. Then there's an emphasis on eternal thinking when you get to verse number 17, calling on him as Father. When we live with eternity in our minds, that's going to mean constant prayer to God. God, the one who provides and prepares eternity for us. We're told earlier in the book, we've been born again, 1 in verse 3. We're told in chapter 2 to desire the word and the will of God, just as a baby desires milk from his mother. And so now we're told again, you cry out to the Father. He's the Father who judges impartially. There's an eternity in mind when we're crying out to the God who gives us eternity to be with him. We cannot deepen our eternal mindset without leaning on him in prayer. Since we are quick to cry out to him when emergencies and difficulties do arise, we must also keep crying out to him before they ever arise in the first place. Hey, Don, check the foyer there. Look at verse 18. We reference this knowing that you were ransomed from the feudal ways inherited by your forefathers. Notice the standard of this ransom. The ransom is not from earthly possessions. It's not from an earthly standard of wealth, but it's from an even greater standard. It's from something greater than silver or gold, but it's with the precious blood of Christ. You've been brought into life with God. You've been brought into a place where your eternity is already secured, and it's not with something that you can measure with a dollar amount. It's not with something that you can leverage for your own influence. It's the precious blood of Christ that's been shed for your best interest, your place in heaven. And so here again, you find the beauty of this sacrificial Jewish language. Yes, you may be of a Gentile background, but now look, someone, Jesus Christ, has given himself as the price of ransom, just as a lamb that is spotless, a lamb that is without blemish for you. Now, as we apply this in the midst of our current culture, remember this, there are two dominant forces. Whatever the end might be in a given situation, there are two kind of tools they can use, two different levers they can pull and try to get their way. But this eternity that's secured with God and with Christ, the hope that's to be revealed to us, the being ransomed by Jesus' blood, they give us confidence that we first cannot be bought off. We cannot be bought off because anything that would be used to buy us off, its value pales in comparison to the value of the precious blood of Christ. There's nothing that's more attractive to us that could buy us off than what's already been paid for us in the precious blood of Christ. So there's no leverage that anyone with money could have over us to turn our backs on God. But likewise, neither can anyone truly cancel us. No one can be canceled and written off because, notice in the text, it's God who judges. And it's God alone who judges justly, who cannot be swayed himself, who cannot be partial. He is, in fact, impartial. And so because he is the one who has secured our souls through that blood of Jesus, we have great confidence. And no one can truly cut us off. No one can truly cancel us and our influence because he is the one who has secured our eternities. So when will we know? When will we know that we are prepared or not? It'll be that final day. That's why we set our hope on that final day. That's why we do keep looking back to the cross as the moment in which our souls were ransomed from sin, knowing that he will deliver us once and for all from this culture, any culture in the future. Tonight, if your certainty is not there, if you know that you are outside of Christ, then the text is clear that you're not prepared. Not prepared for any cultural threat of immorality, but likewise not prepared at all for the return of Jesus Christ. And so we'd love to assist you in being prepared tonight. Would you come to Him and put Him on in baptism? Baptism for the forgiveness of your sins. Would you make that decision, that step tonight, and do so before it's too late? If you've made that decision, you are a Christian, but you have wandered away. You've not been living as one who's prepared, who's set your minds on His things, and who's lived within His light. You can come back to Him. He doesn't want you to wait. He wants you to come back to Him tonight, and we want you to as well. We'll be here to pray with you tonight and with you to walk with you throughout anything moving forward. Please know that we're here to help. If we can help you with anything at all, would you come and come now as we sing.